I'm Heidi Parkes. Welcome to the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts. In the spring of 2025, we are here at the museum for Soft Magic. It is the mid-career exhibition for me, and there's an exhibition catalog, and I'm about to take you on a tour to see the works in the show. The first time that I ever made a quilt was in 2003 while I was a student at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I was in a metalworking class. The assignment was to make something as important on the outside as it was on the inside. And in this quilt, I used pieces of copper that I pressed textiles into, fabric, photographs, and book pages. After metalworking class, I took multi-level abstract drawing with Judith Geichman, and I made teeny tiny drawings that I crocheted lace around. And then finally, I had the brilliant idea to take a fiber arts class. That class was with Diana Guerrero Macia, and the quilt that I've highlighted here from that class is made with the book Heidi, my namesake, and I rearranged each chapter to become a block in the quilt, and I crocheted the blocks to each other. During my senior year, I studied with Ann Wilson in a class called Art and the Everyday, and I decided to highlight artifacts, things from my everyday life that felt special, like getting ice cream cones with my sweetheart, or a train pass because I was commuting to school my senior year, and other little bits of ephemera and receipts. I was a high school art teacher for 9 years, and during that last year as a teacher in 2013, I made my first fabric quilt. My grandmother had purchased a log cabin quilt at an estate sale for $37.50 and stored it in a Tupperware for about a decade. And when my mom was cleaning up her home and helping her downsize, she saw that quilt top and said, "I bet Heidi could do something with that." And so ultimately I did. I sewed the back of the quilt, which is what you see here, to that log cabin quilt that's on the other side. And I began quilting a heart in the middle because it represented the heart and hearth of the home in a log cabin. And I also used some special moments like a sheep, this little plant growing. And at the bottom, I had fallen so in love with sewing through fabric that I added a label on the quilt describing all of the details. It says, Heidi Parkes, September 2013, sewn while watching Fringe, back found by my grandma Mimi, Marion Montgomery, inspired by Gee's Bend, made at 229 East North Avenue, advised by my dear friend Kat. While making this quilt, I certainly discovered that sewing with fabric is popular for a reason. Next up, we'll look at flower fence. As I dove into making quilts, I was very deeply inspired by the quilts of Gee's Bend. This is one example that I began using a tablecloth that has a chain link fence in the background behind the flowers. And then I also made Tame Me Please. That was made with fabrics that I purchased when I was in Seoul, South Korea in early 2015. And then I also used some fabric that I dyed black. I was trying to highlight the quilting with that dark fabric. Night Flight number 1 was the beginning of a long series that celebrated looking out the window of an airplane while flying at night. I was on my way home from visiting my mom in Florida for Thanksgiving when I looked out the window and was inspired to make this quilt. The series is partly inspired by Georgia O'Keeffe and her beautiful paintings of looking down at the clouds from an airplane. The quilt behind me is I Know the Stars Are There Beyond the Clouds 2. It's 11 feet tall, and it was very inspired by my trip to Seoul in South Korea. While I was there, I went to the Insadong neighborhood and learned jogakbo and bojagi techniques from Sam Zizarang. I used that visible whip stitch piecing to make this my first hand-pieced quilt. I also was very inspired by Rachel Carey George, one of the Gee's Bend quilters who has a quilt here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at the local art museum. and she had exposed knots on the quilt that were making an intentional design. Just the knot, no tail, and I used those exposed knots in this quilt to represent more and more stars adding up. This exhibition includes many works from my teachers, students, and some collaborations. Behind me is 15,000 Days by Shauna Doring. I first met her at QuiltCon, hosted by the Modern Quilt Guild, where she had a quilt on exhibition. And then later, she took some classes with me. This class began in Diary Quilting. We were looking at storytelling as well as casting spells into the future and noticing everyday minutiae. That is part of the heart of the idea of soft magic as well, the idea that you can influence life and celebrate good things with soft magic. In the class, Diary Quilting, I was making a quilt as an example of the work that I do with diary quilting. And the quilt that I made is grapes, jam, raisins, wine. It was celebrating me aging and being on the cusp of turning 40 and thinking about the way that grapes can last a very long time depending on what they're made into. I have moments like a chair that I sew in because I wanted to cast a spell that I would spend less time at the computer and more time in my sewing chair. In Shauna's case, she made 15,000 knots, one representing every day that she had been alive up until creating the quilt. She also highlighted that she had recently purchased land on which she planned to build a house in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. And the log cabin design that you see there is her casting a spell that it would happen. In 2019, Amanda Nadig took her first ever quilting class from me here at the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Art. Within 6 months, she was on fire for quilts, making them all the time. And now in 2025, she's an established quilter. I was thrilled to have this piece that highlights her embroidery and hand piecing. This quilt is a collaboration with Joe Cunningham, Stephanie Fortnan, and Luke Haynes, and myself. We started with a thrift store quilt, and then each of us destroyed it and repaired it. I did a lot of the hand quilting as well as re-pieced the quilt after Stephanie had taken it apart and dyed the fabric. Here at the museum, Shauna Doring and Vanessa Frund-Baden met each other when they were taking a workshop from me on improvisational hand quilting. Vanessa had found this quilt top and mended it with lots of beautiful, colorful circles over the holes in the top. And she brought the quilt to the class with me to learn how to hand quilt it. As we looked at quilting and looked at this beautiful top, we talked about ways that she could actually quilt less where the arms are so that they become a focal point and are easier to see, as well as adding knots, visible knots on the surface of the quilt to create more visual interest. Vanessa used a shisha technique to attach a buffalo nickel into the palm of a hand that she embroidered. In 2020, I was an artist in residence with the Art Servancy program here in Milwaukee County. I made it my business to go to Lake Park along beautiful Lake Michigan at least once a week. And I decided throughout that experience to pay more attention to having a zero waste practice, or at least the dream of a zero waste practice. And I started to catalog my scraps. I noticed that because I typically back quilts with white muslin in wide yardage, I end up after each quilt having a strip that is 20 feet long by 2 inches wide. And after making quite a few quilts, that's a lot of white scraps. In this quilt, Cream Sugar Snow, I started to piece those scraps to each other, along with using a technique that I call pleating, because I'm folding the fabric and sewing along the fold instead of cutting the fabric to make both a beautiful composition and use up that excess waste. This quilt is the most recent in a favorite series of mine. It is called Magical Thinking Attempt number 10. I began the series as a way to solve some health problems, And then the quilt series has evolved into solving emotional problems as well, to cast a spell to create a better life for me. This particular quilt casts a spell for protection and good working relationships. It began when I was teaching in France, and I was so excited about that I dyed some fabric with onion skins in honor of French onion soup. When I was in France, I struggled with jet lag, and I wanted to depict myself in the typical positions that I fall asleep and that I wake up in. I often wake up with my right quilting arm over my head, and then I also dutifully fall asleep on my left side according to Ayurveda, which you can see my knees and heels and toes here in gold beads that I found in the flea market in France. Upon returning home from France, I added more and more to the quilt to cast that spell, and that includes the silhouette of my brother's pug, Penelope, as well as some fireflies. My dad passed away in 2018, and I typically think of fireflies as a protective energy from him. And so having 18 little neon circle fireflies feels like him protecting me and infusing that energy into the quilt. This is probably my most romantic quilt. Magical Thinking attempt number 8 was made on the occasion of the 3-year anniversary with my current partner, Beau. We've been together 5.5 years as of this filming. And when we were about to hit 3 years, I was really thinking about how serious we were going to be and the longevity of our relationship. And I wanted to better understand what 3 years meant and looked like. So I made some tally marks in the corner of the quilt, adding up to 3 years, 3 times 365. I call Beau my sweetheart, and so I used a sugar sack in the quilt. And I was also thinking about the levels of togetherness and independence that we wanted in our relationship. To depict that, I used a pair of chairs side by side. I also used a chair all by itself, showing that we had the freedom to be our independent selves. Additionally, I included a couch because sometimes I want us to be a couple, a joint unit together. And then finally, I included rocking chairs because I wanted us to be envisioning a future together in old age with rocking chairs. The quilt highlights many special memories and moments in our relationship, including the fact that Beau loves my cooking and appreciates everything I make. A time he complimented me when I was wearing a new dress that I hemmed. You can see the fabric from trimming the hem on the bottom. And a shared vacation that we took to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I bought a hat at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. Yes, More Please is another spell casting quilt. This one was made in collaboration with my good friend, Zach Foster. We were both elated to have arrived at a point in our careers where we were sustainably self-employed as quilters. We wanted more, please, and we made this quilt to celebrate that idea. We were also struck by the dichotomy that in order to protect a big yes, we were both supporting each other in lots of little no's throughout the year. That saying no to things that would distract us or stretch us too thin was an important part of the yes. I submitted this quilt to be at QuiltCon with the Modern Quilt Guild in 2025, and there it received Best Hand Quilting, which is one of the 3 most special awards in the show, as well as Judge's Choice from Allison Glass. In the quilt, we have a couple special hellos to each other. For example, I made some rabbits and a deer. The rabbit is an animal I feel very connected to, and the deer is an animal that Zach is very connected to, as well as a pair of giraffes that Zach embroidered with their necks twisting together to give them a view of the scope and plan their futures. So Many Small Things is a quilt that I pieced with a machine as well as by hand. And it is this blue color in celebration of being made during my artist in residence at the Pfister Hotel in 2024. I submitted this quilt to QuiltCon 2025, and it received 2nd place in improvisation and Judge's Choice from Tammy Rubin. This very special quilt is Muse Pandemic Invisible Sweetheart. It is the headlining quilt for Soft Magic, and I made it at the beginning of 2020, starting in April, when we were waiting in long lines to vote here in the state of Wisconsin. I decided to add to it a little bit every day for 100 days as part of the 100-day project. It was sparked in part by a conversation that I had with my therapist, who was helping me put some perspective into having to cancel work and rearrange my life for the pandemic. We were reflecting on the way it was a significant moment in history, and that later generations might look at this quilt and art the same way that I would look back at the Spanish influenza, and in particular work from Egon Schiele, who I adore his art, and he passed away during that time. I added a variety of things that marked the time and helped me understand that time was passing, like the chives that bloom in the spring, the silhouettes of plates that I eat off of, and the rabbit, who I appreciate very much. A rabbit, when it's sleeping, makes something called a muse, which is a dent in the grass where its warm body has changed the shape of the grass, and you can see that a rabbit has slept there. And I was thinking a lot about the things that we're consciously doing and unconsciously doing. I also added some applique with transparent silk because there was a focus on the invisible during that time. The quilt has since become my most popular photo on Instagram and has really helped me to grow my following, and I feel very grateful to this quilt because of that. This quilt, Mimi Mimi Mimi, named for my grandma Mimi, was made in Santa Fe, New Mexico when I was teaching a travel diary quilting class, and also on the occasion of an ambiguous loss with my grandma. So she had dementia for about the last decade of her life, and we were in the midst of that time when I was making this quilt. And so going back to Santa Fe, where she had lived when I was in elementary school and junior high, brought back some of my most tender and warm memories of Mimi. Smelling the smells, seeing the sights, things like that reminded me of our best memories together. For example, she used to enjoy shopping at a resale store called Jackalope, and I hadn't thought about that in so long, but remembering that moment and the name of that store felt very special. It was also a great occasion to add a jackalope, a rabbit with the antlers of an antelope, onto the quilt. This quilt was in Quilt National at the Dairy Barn in Athens, Ohio, and was also at QuiltCon 2025, where it received third place in handwork. A moment that I think is only visible in the quilt when I point it out is the silhouette of my arm. So here I've filled in my arm with weaving, and that was to cast a spell for the good health of my quilting arm. I also used metal milagros that are part of the tradition in Santa Fe and in Mexico to wish good things for particular body parts for good health. This is another travel diary quilt. It's one that I made while teaching in Japan in the spring of 2024. Bloom Becoming Intrepid Flourish is a quilt that tracks my time there. Some of the things that were very special is that in Japan they don't have public garbage cans. You have to keep track of your trash, and I kept track of my trash on the quilt itself. All those little tiny thread scraps are things that I sewed down onto the surface of the quilt. I also was very fortunate to get to co-teach with my friend Hikaru Noguchi. She lives in Japan, and we had taught together online a mending class with the Makery. But getting to teach in person and having her share her mending techniques with my students for an afternoon was really a special treat. Including work from my professors at SAIC is a true highlight of this exhibition. Here you can see a piece by Diana Guerrero Macia and a piece by Ann Wilson. They inspired me tremendously when I was in school and have been very supportive of me since graduation as well. Deanna was very influential to me in thinking about my quilts as paintings. She refers to her textile works as paintings. She also uses a lot of visible stitches. And here you can see these tan stitches against the orange background. And then more subtle are the charcoal gray stitches along these thin lines of black felt. Anne Wilson embroidered with human hair in a lot of her work, including this piece that's on loan from the Racine Art Museum. And that inspired me to use more of my own body material in my work. This is Magical Thinking attempt number 5, and like all of the previous attempts in that series, it was made with my menstrual blood to dye fabric. I used that because I was at the end of solutions with Western medicine. They were telling me that I could get a hysterectomy, or there wasn't much else they could do for me and that I should see a naturopath. I ended up going down a lot of rabbit holes on YouTube and the internet, and many of them said that making a painting with my blood would make me healthy again. I thought that was kind of preposterous and really disappointing advice, and so I made the work initially to poo-poo the idea and to show how frustrated I was with medicine. However, during the course of making these works, I did get better, and that influenced the title very much and helped me to believe that there was a real soft magic and a power in making quilts and setting an intention in them. I think that in truth, and through talking to my therapist about this work, it helped me to stop othering that part of my body the same way that I might talk about a bad arm, and instead helped me embrace that part of my body. Talking about the art also helped me to speak more intentionally with my doctors and my naturopath so that I could get the care that I needed without being too embarrassed to speak about the work. Since 2016, when I first started incorporating visible knots into my work, because of the quilt by Rachel Carey George, I have inspired and influenced a lot of quilters to put knots on the surface of their quilts. It was essential to me that in the Soft Magic exhibition, we have a quilt that was a nod towards the reason why I started to incorporate knots on the surface of my quilts. This particular quilt is by Maggie Townsend, and it is on loan from the International Quilt Museum in Lincoln, Nebraska. And it is originally part of the collection of Roderick Kirikoff. I adore his book, Unconventional and Unexpected, Quilts Below the Radar. And he came out for the opening reception for this exhibition and was on a panel discussion with me and Amanda Nadig. And getting to hear his perspective on the work and getting to celebrate this beautiful quilt with exposed knots was a real treat. In 2018, I made But What Was It Like? I was reflecting on some online dating experiences and going down the rabbit hole of looking back at our previous messages together, noticing that sometimes I was in the blue, where I sent much longer messages than my date sent. And I was trying to figure out how we had arrived at going out on 2 dates that I thought were fun that he did not want to repeat. So in this quilt, I used a technique that I like to call verbing, where I recreate what's happening in real life in quilt form. So for example, I wanted to feel in the quilt like an archaeologist, rifling through my text messages, but instead I was rifling through my scraps of fabric. I was noticing the times where I had made circles previously, and now I had little negative space circle fabric that I wanted to figure out something to do with. I also had been storing all the little bits of tails of thread from quilting and embroidering, and I layered those scraps of thread in the bottom left-hand corner of the quilt. The layering, overlapping, and the fog that's created with the silk scrim on top, it's silk organza, create that feeling of rifling through memories and trying really hard to get it right. This is my most recently finished quilt in Soft Magic. It's Softly, Gently, Slowly, Fast. I was making it at the end of my artist in residence at the Pfister Hotel, and in the lead up to the Soft Magic exhibition opening. I depicted a calendar on the quilt using blue for the time that I was at the Pfister, and then a floral that I got at the annual rummage here at the museum to depict the moment when I was really excited about Soft Magic. I finished this quilt on the first day of our 3-day installation of the show, and I am thrilled with the height of this quilt. I wanted to go bigger because it felt so special to be celebrating this exhibition. Another fun part of the quilt is my foot bird. I traced my foot with my toes spread wide as well as with my socks on and created a bird. And that was because I stepped on an ice cube in an unfortunate way at the Pfister and twisted my foot. I had to miss a lot of yoga classes because of resting my foot, and those yoga mats are in the bottom left corner of the quilt. I also think about my mom a lot when I'm quilting, and sometimes I incorporate our family tablecloth that we used for several decades for holidays and birthdays. And the center medallion of the tablecloth is in the bottom of the quilt. It was very special when my mom flew up from Florida to see this quilt and enjoy the show with me. I believe that before I was born, my grandmother Mimi and our family and friends cast a spell for my well-being, for me to lead a happy life, and ultimately maybe even for me to be a quilter. They did that by making my baby quilt. Each person made a block, and my grandma made 2 blocks. And then my grandmother Mimi put the quilt together. There are moments that include, "Oh, little one, welcome to life," a bunny rabbit, and an umbrella for protection from my grandma. This next quilt is one that I made after the 2016 election. I've always been very close with my mother, and she's been passionate about me being a woman who votes in every election. And so after us all being Obama fans living in Chicago, it was a surprise that after she moved to Florida, she was voting in a way that was not the same as me. This quilt reflects on that and ultimately lands with some text that is lighter in color that, for example, says, "I voted like my neighbors and my mom voted like her neighbors." It's made with an IKEA curtain that my mom hemmed for me when I moved out of her home at the tender age of 30. And I have a little arrow that says, "Right here, my mom hemmed these curtains for me in 2012. It was an undeniable act of love and care and reminded me of the full picture of our relationship. The curtain was transparent, and I was able to unfurl lots of thread that I think shows the tangled and tied up in knots feeling that many, many families have experienced in America about politics since 2016. This next family-oriented quilt is one that I made in collaboration with my nephew, Colin, back when he was 4 years old. We laid out a lot of fun fabrics, and they were all fabrics that had been mailed to me from Okamoka in Seoul in South Korea. I was invited to be in an exhibition of bojagis and bojagi-inspired quilts. Their bright and joyful prints were part of the Double Happiness project. And to me, double happiness meant working in collaboration with others. So joyfully playing with Tanuki Mario and thinking about the gooseberry nets in Peter Rabbit was a fun way to engage my 4-year-old nephew in working on the composition. You might especially appreciate the pepperoni pizza on the right side of that quilt. Lastly, in this section is a quilt that I made on the occasion of reflecting about 2021. It was a very special year for me. I had a lot of joy in my personal relationships, in my health, and in my business. And I was also very aware that it was not a wonderful year for many people. 2021 was a very complicated year during the pandemic. Many folks, when they first see this quilt, don't see the calendar, and it's a lot of fun for me to be able to point it out to them. The calendar begins with January in the top left corner of the quilt and loops around with all the months until December in the top right corner. I used several codes to better understand what happened in 2021 so that I could cast a spell to invite more of that into 2022 and beyond. Some of the codes involve using a dark green fabric on the days when I was teaching live, either on Zoom or in person, as well as using a red thread. My favorite color of thread from DMC cotton is number 606. And that number 606 is one that I used to track my cycle, because that was a big part of getting healthier, was tracking my cycle. And I've continued to use calendars in my quilt ever since Magical Thinking attempt number 1, where I depicted a calendar in it. I was also struck that I did not have any teaching engagements in May, July, or August, and that time to rest, pause, reflect, and make plans is highlighted by me circling with a big red line the month of November. That's the moment when my online shop went live and I sold over 20 quilts on my website. Small quilts, but selling quilts nonetheless in a way that was very exciting for me. Magical Thinking attempt number 9 began as a travel diary quilt when I was teaching in Sardinia, Italy. And then it became much more than that, because I realized I was reclaiming my relationship with Italy. I, once upon a time in my 20s, was engaged to an Italian, and we were together for a decade. And that's when I learned to speak a lot of the Italian language and spent my summers there while I was a high school art teacher. I had not spoken much Italian or gone back there for over a decade. And when I decided I wanted to teach abroad, I thought that my language skills and knowledge of Italy would be an advantage working with a company that was new to me. It was really surprising to see how much Italian I could speak when I was the most bilingual person in the room. And so I incorporated some text. The text is a nod to a quote from Anais Nin, where she says, "And the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was a larger risk than the risk it took to blossom." And so I began with, "And the day came when I returned, and then so many words tumbled once more from my lips." The quilt incorporates a cave, some pieces of lace, learning about the history of fairies in Sardinia, and making cyanotypes, which are photos that are made on pre-treated fabric that are exposed to the sun in that heat of the Italian sun in July. In Magical Thinking attempt number 7, it was the first time that I worked on a new health ailment instead of my hormonal health and my cycle. This time it was about having floaters in my eyes. They were very frustrating. I discovered I had them in 2019. And ultimately, I've learned over the years that you have to treat them similarly to tinnitus. You have to just learn to ignore them and not be worried about them. But I am a person who has suffered from mosquitoes and them being itchy for my whole life. And so seeing little itty bitty gray dots around me makes me very afraid, as though they're mosquitoes. This quilt was part of the process of learning to recognize the difference between an eye floater, which is part of me and inside of me, and a mosquito, which is out and about in the world. I did that in a few ways, partly by depicting for the viewer what it feels like to me. So imagine this yellow circle is my head, and all these other little circles are floating around outside of me. It feels sometimes as though I could catch a floater in my hand. I am also verbing, doing the thing that I want to do in real life on the quilt by, over here on the right side, being naughty and noticing all of these little bits of scrap fabric layered behind the quilt top, and I'm focusing on them and outlining them and looking at them closely. But I try not to do that with my floaters. Instead, I try to ignore them, and here the quilting is sweeping across the surface of the quilt as though the floaters aren't there and the scraps of fabric aren't influencing the path of the quilting lines at all whatsoever. The quilt has a lot of nature in it because at the time that I began it, I was teaching on Madeline Island alongside my friend Zach Foster. This is Scavenger Hunt, I Listened, and it is a quilt that I made with my first ever quilt pattern that I wrote for other people to make. One thing that's unique about the pattern is that it's full of prompts where the maker is asked to make something and follow directions, but not have it be exactly like mine. An example is my birthday block. I was born on December 13th, so mine is 12 inches across and 13 inches down. You can imagine that there's a wonderful variety in the birthday blocks that other makers use. I also incorporated 4 things that I touch every day. I traced the left side of my body, and I traced a bowl in a color that reflects if I'm a night person or a morning person. Now we'll continue to the entrance of the museum where we'll see more works from my students and myself in soft magic. When you first walk into the museum, you see this quilt, Places Unfold. I began it in 2014 during the end of my last year as a high school art teacher. It was a fun challenge to think about things that I could prepare in the evening so that then I could sew efficiently during the day when I had natural breaks or was working alongside my students. There are some fun examples of the aerial views from Google Maps of my homes where I lived at the time and previously had lived. I also thought about umbrellas at the beach from above, a highway, walking, and then you drop and fumble and pick something up and then keep going on your way. All different ways of thinking about how we move in the world, looking up and looking down. In 2016, I submitted this quilt to QuiltCon where it received first place in handwork, and that recognition allowed me to teach a lot more on a national level. In 2018, Emily Zarcy was a young mother who got 3 days away to take a class from me in Illinois. In this class, I was teaching about piecing and especially a technique that I love called pleating, where she was folding the fabric, sewing it, and then opening it up. She worked on this quilt all day in class, and then she went back to her hotel room and sewed some more. The title is I Love You More Than Sleep, and it follows the journey from the moon and nighttime, working her way up towards sunrise, wondering how much she would have to care for her baby compared to how much she would be able to sleep. And of course, the title shares a lot of her heartfelt feelings for her kiddo, but also her desire to balance caring for herself. This is I Know the Stars Are There Beyond the Clouds #1, the first in the series, and it is a recent acquisition of the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Art. It was donated by Susan Graham Wernicke, and she is one of my very treasured collectors. She's a past president of the Quilt Museum, and she's one of the main sponsors of the exhibition as well. I first met Susan in 2015 when I was volunteering here at the Quilt Museum in the education committee. Susan was on the same committee, and she has been an incredible support and advisor and sounding board ever since. This is Magical Thinking Attempt #1, the quilt that started a series that's been very meaningful to me. It was this area that I first began to dye my fabric with my blood, and I was so frustrated when I began this quilt. One of the things that was fascinating about writing the book Soft Magic was going back through all of the quilts to figure out when my reoccurring character of the calendar came into the quilt. And so this is the very first calendar because I was using that to mark the days of my cycle. And then these are very interesting. I was applying the material to wet fabric instead of dry fabric, and it was fascinating to see the way that it transformed. And there was just a lot of fun experimentation that happened here, and it was one of those early moments of finding fun within a problem, as well as finding beauty within a problem. These 2 quilts were made by friends, Barbara Cameron and Amy Walker. They're both in my year-long quilt making class, and Barbara was inspired by some of the earlier modules around technique and experimentation. We were looking at artists like Mark Bradford and Deb Sokolow. Barbara ended up thinking a lot about her mother's practice of having tea and using stevia, which she did not use. I also am not a big stevia fan, so I could relate to that work. And this is I Made Tea number 2, one of many experimentations that she did by sewing with materials that were not fabric. Amy Walker's quilt Sherbert was an exploration of color, of hand piecing. I really love these playful moments of stripes in the composition, and I especially love the seriousness that Amy brought to investigating color in all of the work that she made in class. Both of these quilts have a beautiful international element to them. Meet Me in Geneva was made by Malini in my class that I taught in France. And then she went on to do a special llama walk in Geneva. The quilt articulates many special things about the trip, including the temperature on the days that we were together, a fun experience that she had getting her bag back after it was lost, and especially a moment where I encouraged her to pluck up the courage to cut into a dress that she had purchased. The quilt by Claire is one that she made while living in Germany. She's originally from the Wisconsin area, and she took my framed quilts class online. In this particular quilt, she was using some very special naturally dyed fabrics and also making some fun explorations, things that I hadn't done yet, in terms of stretching something that's not quilted and having the perimeter of the quilt be more complicated instead of framed in a smooth frame going all the way around. Here in the micro gallery of the museum, I am near 2 dresses and a quilt. This quilt was made by Robin Romaine in my year-long quilt making class, and she discovered that her mother over the years had just replaced her ironing board cover by putting a new one over top the old one about 5 times. So she had an amazing material of many old ironing board covers to work with in this quilt. She created a binding with handkerchiefs and a beautiful improvisational style in her piecing. I am near a dress as well by Twinkie Chan, who works for Creative Bug, and I launched a pattern with Creative Bug called the Daily Practice Quilt Top, and this in particular was the Story Quilt Top pattern. She took that quilt top idea and instead applied it to a dress, which was a very exciting new direction to see the pattern go. This last dress is by Cal Patch, and she also teaches with Creative Bug on occasion. She traveled with me to Japan and worked on a dress rather than on a quilt top in class. Very, very exciting way to make a travel diary quilt. At the end of my Creative Bug class on making a story quilt top, I nudge makers to try to look at the prompts and see if one of them spoke to them an especially large amount, and then maybe their next quilt could be just that one prompt on repeat. Faith Hale, who also works for Creative Bug, took me up on that idea. She had enjoyed tracing breasts in her quilt, and she made this boob quilt, imagining and exploring all different kinds and ways for boobs to be. It really made me chuckle and is such a joyful, fun, celebratory quilt. Next to it is a piece by Sherry Ramsey. She's in my year-long class, and she does a lot of work where she thinks about true crime, investigating that idea. And so, partly inspired by my work with blood, she went about recreating blood to have it look more real instead of sepia toned. She used red ink and found that after many different trials, that was the best way to get the color she wanted. On the sides of the quilts, she burnt the edges and marked them with the exhibit number as a way of cataloging those bits of evidence from a crime scene. She also had it framed professionally so that all these pieces float so beautifully together, working as a whole. The 6x6" framed approach is also from my framed quilts class. CJ Juska has studied with me in France, in Italy, and also in my online quilt making class, which this piece was made during. It has a beautiful minimalist composition and some details with text that are even very hard to see in subtler colors on the quilt. It also reminds me about some of my goals in co-curating the show with Emily Schliemowitz, the curator here at the museum. We wanted to highlight past, present, and future in a way that's similar to what I do with my diary quilts, but to get into past, connecting to my professors and inspirations, present, connecting to my collaborations, and then future, connecting to my students and that legacy that I'm hopefully leaving behind. These last 3 quilts are all from students who took my year-long quilt making course. Selena made this quilt before that when she was in diary quilting with me. This quilt, 23 Octobers, is her laying on top of cyanotype fabric and includes all of her journals and diaries that she's used over the years. In completing the quilt, she added a detail to each diary, telling some of the stories in it. So it's very much a quilt about reminiscing and then also her hopes for the future. This quilt is by Eleanor Kagan, and it has a wonderful title that she's embroidered on the quilt. It is Untitled, or I hate wearing this underwear, but the fabric can't be recycled, so I'm using them for this instead of throwing them in the trash. I can so deeply relate with Eleanor about buying something that you think will fit and be comfortable, and then it's not. And this commitment to zero waste or wasting less things is really beautifully depicted in this quilt. I also love its abstract composition. I think it speaks really beautifully with C.J. Juska's black and blue quilt as well. Like a Record Skipping is by Sarah Lind, and here she was inspired by some of the early modules in the quilt making class when we watched a video with Mark Bradford, one of my favorite artists, being interviewed for 60 Minutes by Anderson Cooper. She found this quote from him that she resonated with a lot, and I loved that she added it to the quilt with all of the ums and breaks in thought as she followed through and became also very inspired by Mark Bradford. Thank you very much for joining me on this tour of soft magic at the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts. I appreciate your interest in my art, your curiosity, and your willingness to be here for all of these stories. I am excited that now you've perhaps been introduced to some new artists that you'll be able to research, as well as I hope I've piqued your curiosity about quilting. I love to teach quilting and diary quilting, and those are things that you can join me for throughout the year, online and in person. I want to thank the museum, as well as curator Emily Schliemowitz, the museum director, Melissa Ralsted, and our sponsor for the exhibition, Susan Graham-Warnicki. Their insights have been invaluable in putting this exhibition together and their support. I hope that you will be interested in continuing to follow along with me. I share tours like this on YouTube where you can hopefully like and subscribe. I also share a lot with my email newsletter. That will have the most up-to-date information about exhibitions, videos, new work, classes, and all the things that I do. They're always in one place in the newsletter once a month. I also share most things with my name, so my website is heidiparkes.com, and that's where you can find the newsletter. I'm also on Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube as Heidi Parkes. Thank you again, and I appreciate you being here for Soft Magic.